Many of you know that I live in Japan and I spend a lot of time studying Japanese. One of my latest study methods is listening to the news in Japanese every day. This has been such an incredible tool for improving my language. My comprehension is better, I know more vocabulary, and most importantly, I like listening to the news. If you're similar to me, then you need to check out today's episode sponsor. Simple English News Daily, or the Send 7 podcast, is an incredible podcast designed for intermediate English learners. Every day, they introduce you to the breaking news stories, the most important current events across the world. They release episodes 5 days a week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And the best part, their episodes are just 7 minutes long, which makes it perfect to fit into your daily study routine. Grab a coffee, listen to Simple English News Daily, learn about the world, and improve your English at the same time. They have been such great sponsors and supporters of Thinking in English over the past few years, so go and show them some love. It is free to listen to Simple English News Daily. You can listen on whatever podcasting platform you like. Search it on Spotify, search it on Apple Podcasts, or click the link in the description of this podcast, of course. Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level learners of English. This episode is going to take a detailed look at culture shock. We'll define both culture shock and reverse culture shock, and then discuss the various stages you go through while experiencing culture shock. And at the end of this episode, I'll share some of my experiences and give you advice on how to deal with this frustrating phenomenon. You can find a full transcript for this episode available for free on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as on my blog. Here is today's vocabulary list. Puzzled. Puzzled. Feeling confused because something is difficult to understand. As in, I was puzzled when the bank gave me a cash card instead of a debit card. Overwhelming. Overwhelming. Very intense or difficult to deal with, often causing feelings of being unable to cope. For example, moving to a new country can be overwhelming. Frustrated. Frustrated. Feeling annoyed or upset because you cannot achieve or understand something. As in, I became frustrated when I couldn't find shoes in my size in Japan. Disoriented. Disoriented. Feeling confused and unsure about your surroundings and situation. As in, I felt disoriented when I first moved abroad, as everything seems so different from what I was used to back home. Open-minded. Open-minded. Willing to consider new ideas, experiences, and perspectives. As in, being open-minded helped me adapt to the new culture. Norm. Norm. A standard, pattern, or typical behaviour that is considered normal within a group or society. For example, in Japan, it's a norm to take off your shoes before entering a house. Adaptable. Adaptable. Able to adjust or change in response to new situations or environments. For instance, being adaptable is crucial when living in a foreign country. I live in a culture that is very different from the culture in which I grew up. I'm an English guy from a small village in the English countryside with a family that is entirely British, now living in the countryside of Japan with a Japanese wife. Over the past 8 years, I have spent years living in the south of Japan, Tokyo, and now further north in the country. While I love living in Japan, there are definitely times when I am puzzled or confused or frustrated by certain cultural factors here. For example, most bank accounts in Japan don't offer a debit or credit card straight away. Instead, they give you a cash card that purely allows you to withdraw money from ATMs. Without a debit card or a credit card, you can't buy things online easily. Instead, you have to pay via bank transfer, or via cash on delivery, or by paying at convenience stores. This was a big shock coming from the UK, where every bank account gives you a debit card. I had to get used to reserving bus or train tickets online, then walking to the bank ATM to get cash out, and then walking to the convenience store with my reservation number to pay in cash. There were many other challenges and confusions, especially at the beginning. Needing to take my shoes off before entering the school I worked at, paying at the counter rather than at the table in a restaurant, not being able to find shoes my size, cheap capsule hotels and hostels with a communal bath rather than private showers, very little kitchen space in every apartment I've lived in, and sitting on the floor rather than on chairs. These are just a few of the various things about Japanese culture that have shocked me. The new experiences, new expectations on me, and new settings were often overwhelming. This feeling of being overwhelmed is known as culture shock. I have been relatively fortunate when it comes to culture shock. I'm quite a flexible person with low expectations and, I think, an open mind, which has helped me to adjust to different cultures. But many of my friends have struggled far more with culture shock, to the extent that they had to leave great jobs or opportunities. Today, I'm going to talk about culture shock. I'll define culture shock, discuss the stages of culture shock, consider reverse culture shock, and end with some suggestions or tips on how to cope with culture shock. Many of you listening to this podcast will have aspirations or plans to move abroad or travel the world. So culture shock is definitely something you should all be aware of and considering. Culture shock is a term often used to describe the feeling of disorientation and discomfort that people experience when they encounter a new culture or an environment significantly different from their own. For me, it was the disorientation I felt dealing with Japanese society after living in the UK until I was 21. While it is most often associated with moving countries, culture shock can also happen when you travel to a different city, start a new job, or interact with people from different cultural backgrounds. Culture shock is the psychological and emotional reaction we experience after being exposed to a new set of norms, behaviours, values, and expectations. The rules and the traditions that you grew up learning and becoming accustomed to may no longer be relevant, or could even be wrong in this new culture. It could be something simple. Maybe you grew up doing your grocery shopping on a Sunday evening in your country. But then you moved to the UK and you realise that all large British supermarkets close at 3 or 4 p.m. on a Sunday. Or, like me, you moved to Japan and you're surprised that Japanese washing machines tend to use cold water rather than hot water. Or it could be something much more important. Your new job could have a very hierarchical and strict work culture, requiring lots of formal language and asking for permission to do things. Or the way healthcare works in your new country could be really different from where you grew up. These experiences can be really unsettling for you, but they are a normal part of life in your new environment, which makes it hard to explain to other people. And while some culture shocks can just be a little confusing or embarrassing, others can make it really difficult to adjust to life in a new culture. It is often said that culture shock comes in 4 stages: the honeymoon stage, the frustration stage, the adjustment stage, and the acceptance stage. When you first move to a new place or enter a new culture, often everything feels new, exciting, fascinating. This is known as the honeymoon stage. You want to eat all of the delicious new foods available in your new home, and you spend days being a tourist, sightseeing around different destinations. Struggles with the language are obviously present, but you don't mind too much because you are in this honeymoon phase. In this stage of culture shock, people often feel emotions like happiness, excitement, and curiosity. When I first moved to Japan back in 2016, my first few weeks in the country were a blur of excitement and new experiences. Every day was challenging, but enjoyable and different. I made friends with my new colleagues, travelled around my new home by bicycle every evening. My boss helped with all the difficult processes of moving into my new home, and I was fascinated by even small things like shopping in a supermarket with completely new ingredients and products. It wasn't until a few months later, when I had started my job and I was left to deal with life on my own, that I started to become more annoyed with parts of life in Japan. The excitement of a new culture gradually wore off, and the differences between my expectations and culture and the expectations of Japanese society became more apparent and frustrating. This is known as the frustration stage. During this stage, it is common to feel emotions like irritation, anxiety, and homesickness. The struggles with language become more obvious and troubling. Perhaps you struggle to make deep friends or form connections with colleagues because you are having issues with communicating, even if you speak the language well. You start to miss the foods you grew up eating. For example, I love Japanese food, but in my first year in Japan, I ate more McDonald's hamburgers than I had at any other point in my life. Was it because McDonald's is my favourite food? No. It is because McDonald's was the only restaurant within 30 minutes of my house that served food I could eat in the UK. Japanese food was more delicious, but I became frustrated that I couldn't eat snacks and dishes from the UK, so I used to go to McDonald's. During this stage, you will also begin to find the local customs maybe a little bit strange and challenging. After frustration comes adjustment. The adjustment stage involves slowly adapting to the new culture, finding routines, and learning how to navigate the differences between your culture and the new culture. The time it takes to adjust depends on the person. In fact, I have friends who never really adjusted to life in a new culture. They just remained frustrated and puzzled for their entire time abroad, and then they left. During the adjustment stage, you become calmer, more flexible, and are more adaptable. You accept the changes and differences and are no longer frustrated by everything. Maybe you start to gain confidence in speaking the local language and understanding the new norms and expectations. Finally, after adjustment comes the adaptation stage. You feel comfortable and at ease in the new culture. In many ways, it may feel like a second home. You become more confident. You feel as though you belong, and you start to integrate. At the same time, you may start to develop true and deep friendships and relationships, participate in events and traditions, and you no longer feel out of place. Culture shock may seem like a relatively obvious concept. You visit a new culture or society with different rules or expectations, and you experience challenges and frustrations. Less obvious, however, is reverse culture shock. Reverse culture shock occurs when you return to your home country after spending significant amount of time abroad and find yourself feeling disoriented, out of place, or even uncomfortable in what you thought was your own culture. Reverse culture shock often feels like a strange and unexpected experience because people often think their return home after a time abroad will be seamless and easy. Instead, you may find that things have changed while you were away, or perhaps you have changed more than you realized. I have struggled with reverse culture shock more than I have with actual culture shock. I am quite flexible and I think open-minded, and while things about Japanese culture do frustrate me, I tend to adjust quickly. The problem is that I struggle to adjust back to British culture when I'm in the UK. I struggle with the food, with the kinds of restaurants and shops in my hometown, the changing climate, and my daily routine, and much more. Reverse culture shock happens because your experiences abroad have altered your perceptions, habits, and worldview. You've adapted to a different way of living, thinking, and interacting, which means your outlook on life may no longer align with what you once considered normal. After spending months or years communicating in another language, you might find it strange to suddenly be surrounded by your own native language again. When you return home, you might feel self-conscious or awkward when you realize that your new habits don't fit in with your home culture. My dad still jokes about the time I bowed when saying thank you at his store, something that is common in Japanese culture but unheard of in the UK. Reverse culture shock can actually be just as challenging as the initial culture shock you felt in the new country. So, culture shock can be frustrating, but it is a normal and natural part of adjusting to a new environment. There are strategies that can help you feel comfortable and at ease in a new culture. One of the most effective ways to prepare is to learn as much as you can about your new environment before you arrive. Research the country's customs, traditions, language, social norms, and daily routines. Familiarize yourself with local etiquette, gestures, greetings, and even dining habits. I watched a lot of videos on YouTube on life in the Japanese countryside and what to expect from my job position before moving in 2016. This took away some of the biggest surprises that I would have encountered, but there were many other culture shocks. If you are moving to a new country, I really recommend reading books, watching documentaries, following influencers, or even taking online courses to learn more about the new culture. For me personally, I think my open-mindedness or curiosity or my lack of expectations have really helped while living in Japan and limited the amount of culture shock I have experienced. Culture shock often comes from comparing your new environment to what you're used to. This is not necessarily bad, but problems can arise when you judge the new environment negatively. Perhaps you consider the cultural differences as strange or as wrong. This is not a helpful mindset. Rather than judging a culture as strange or weird or bad, you should try to approach everything with a sense of curiosity and an open mind. While many of my friends spent a lot of time viewing things about their life abroad negatively, I prefer to learn and understand the reasons behind different customs. I read books about Japanese culture. I even went to university and did a master's degree in Japanese politics, so I could learn more about the culture of this country. I also recommend trying to see things from the perspective of local people. Viewing these differences as opportunities rather than obstacles will make you far more adaptable. Building a support network is essential when coping with culture shock. You need to surround yourself with people who understand your experiences. When I was a teacher in the countryside, I was close to many of the other teachers. When I was a student in Tokyo, I was close with my classmates. Having a group of people who can understand your situation can provide comfort and reduce your feelings of isolation. They can help answer questions you have and share their experiences, from serious issues like visa support to simple things like restaurant recommendations for British food. It was my colleagues back in 2016 who helped me set up a phone contract, used their cars to transport some of my furniture, introduced me to a Japanese teacher, and answered most of my stupid questions. You should also try to stay in touch with both your old lifestyle and your loved ones. Of course, you should immerse yourself in the new culture, but you should also try to maintain a sense of familiarity and stability with your home culture. I call my parents every single weekend to chat for an hour or two, and I exchange messages regularly with my friends back in the UK. I also try to keep some of the habits I had in the UK. Every day, I drink at least 1 cup of tea made using English tea bags. If I ever see something British being sold in Japan, I tend to buy it. I often have shortbread or McVitie's digestive biscuits to eat with my cups of tea. I will buy British beer or British apple cider if I can find it in the supermarket. And when I'm in Tokyo, I'll always get something British. I also recommend cooking meals from your home country. I often make simple shortbread biscuits. And continuing with some of your old hobbies and habits within your own space and your own home. So here is today's final thought. Culture shock is a natural part of adapting to a new environment, especially when moving abroad. It can be challenging, but understanding the stages and being open-minded can help you adjust. This episode has defined culture shock and reverse culture shock, looked at the stages of culture shock, and given you some tips and advice on how to deal with culture shock. Many of you listening will have ambitions to move and travel overseas, and many of you will likely need to deal with culture shock. I also shared a lot of my personal experiences, which have hopefully been useful for all of you listening. You should try to embrace, stay curious, find support, and stay connected to your home culture while abroad. What do you think? Have you ever experienced culture shock or reverse culture shock? Share your experiences with the Thinking in English audience. You can leave a comment on Spotify, you can comment on YouTube if you're listening on YouTube, or you can reach out on social media. My website, my blog articles linked in the description. Instagram, you can send a message or leave a comment on an Instagram post. Or if you're a Patreon subscriber, you should send me a message on Patreon or on Discord. If you want to support Thinking in English, Patreon and Discord are the best place to do that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.